Hello and welcome to a new episode of That Fertile Feeling, the podcast. My name is Françoise and today's episode is part of the series on helping you restore your hormonal balance. So over the past couple of months, I've done episodes on the link between gut health and your reproductive hormones, on the link between your nervous system and your hormones, on the influence that the chemicals in our environment have on our hormones. And today we'll focus on one of the final missing pieces, which is your metabolism. So your metabolism, that's basically what you eat and how your food sets into motion all of these processes, these chemical processes in your body. So this is an episode that's particularly relevant for anyone who's dealing with endometriosis or PCOS, for anyone who often has these very heavy afternoon slumps, also for anyone who's dealing with chronic inflammation, or just, for anyone who wants to know how their food affects their fertility. It's an episode that's close to my heart because really early on in my fertility journey, I developed all of these chronic conditions. I developed asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, even I had this severe acne. All of those things were obvious signs of chronic inflammation going on. And it wasn't something, I think there's more awareness now these days, but back then, I went to the doctor and I got like these really, really heavy corticosteroids to deal with that inflammation with the arthritis. I remember going to the pharmacy and the pharmacist saying like no one my age should be on that high level of medication. So that was the solution, treating the symptoms. And with everything I know now, it was just that, right? It was treating the symptoms and not looking at what was going on in the body and working at the root with what was going on. So I did that myself very intuitively. It took me about a year and a half to get my body back to balance. And it was really off balance. I remember I was so freaked out about what was happening in my body. I even took a test to see if I was in menopause, something I read in a book, and it came back positive. And I thought, oh no, this is the end. I'm 32. I'm in menopause. There's nothing I can do to change this. Well, fast forward 10 years, I'm a mother of 3 healthy children. I definitely wasn't in menopause, but that's where I was at that time. So I wasn't functioning at all with all of those things going on. So I couldn't go to work even. So it really took me about a year and a half to recover, to get my body back to balance. And there were multiple components to that. Mindfulness and breathing exercises were key, really definitely a part of the equation to get my stress levels under control. And stress levels, I've done numerous episodes about this, it's really key when it comes to fighting inflammation and optimizing your hormones, optimizing your fertility. You need to look at your stress. But I definitely also worked with my diet to fight that chronic inflammation. There are many things I did. I will give you some practical advice at the end of this podcast. Like one of the things I did, don't necessarily recommend it to everyone, but in my case, it was necessary, is I cut out sugar completely for 2 or 3 years, I think. And it was actually quite easy because whenever I did eat sugar, I would break out on my face, on my chin straight away. So that's that inflammation that would immediately flare up again. It was such a good signal from my body telling me like, no, don't do this. I started eating much more veggies, protein, all of the things I'll get to in the end of this episode. With the benefit of hindsight, what I did really well with all of these dietary changes is that I started regulating my blood sugar. And what I've come to learn since is that that is actually crucial for fertility, both for female fertility, but also for, testosterone levels and sperm quality in men. So this episode is really relevant for your partner as well, if you have a partner that you're doing this with, a male partner. So what I will do today in this episode is I'll walk you through your digestive system to show you which processes are at work here and how they're influenced by the food that you eat. I'll try to keep it really simple. I went through all of the research. So it can get really technical, but I've tried to keep it simple and straightforward. And then at the end, I'll give you a couple of practical tips that you can really easily integrate in your life to improve your metabolism and your fertility. So your digestive system, how does it work? Obviously, it starts with eating. You are consuming food and it enters your digestive tract. your stomach, which is where the food is broken down in your stomach, in your intestines. It's broken down into these smaller components, primarily the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats. These you know, right? These are the macronutrients that you often hear people talk about. And as your food is broken down in your stomach and in your intestines, these macronutrients are released into the bloodstream. So carbs, your carbohydrates, they are broken down into glucose, which then enters the bloodstream. Proteins, they are broken down into amino acids, which are really essential for building and repairing tissues, also in the reproductive system. That's why you hear so many people in the fertility sphere or just in the wellness sphere talking about the importance of eating enough protein. And then there's fats, which are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. And these components are absorbed or used for energy or stored for future use. That's, your fatty tissues, really. So all of these macronutrients, the carbs, the proteins, the fats, they are absorbed through the intestinal walls into the bloodstream, and then they are transported throughout the body to your cells, where they can then be used for energy, for growth, or for maintenance also. Now let's zoom in on those carbohydrates a bit more, because as I mentioned, they are broken down into glucose, and that glucose then enters your blood. And as your glucose levels rise in the blood, your pancreas starts to secrete insulin. Insulin is a hormone that helps cells take up glucose for energy or storage. So really the cell looks like, do I need energy? And then with that insulin, it can take glucose from your blood. And if the cell doesn't need energy, the glucose is stored in the liver and in the muscle tissues, and thereby your blood sugar levels go down. And then in the process, insulin also works with other hormones. When you have these high insulin levels, this generally increases the production of another hormone that signals to the brain that you're full, so that you stop eating. Your blood sugar is high, insulin is produced, and your brain knows, okay, need to stop eating now. And something similar happens with your hunger hormone. It's called ghrelin. When you have these high, so your glucose goes up when you're eating, insulin is produced by the pancreas, and that reduces the levels of your hunger hormone. So you will feel a sense of fullness after eating. So these are positive things, right? But if these insulin levels are consistently high or elevated, which is the case when you have something called insulin resistance, then that insulin may also start to have more negative effects on other systems in your body, like your reproductive hormones. So basically what happens with insulin resistance is that the cells in the body become less responsive to insulin. So that means that despite the presence of insulin, the cells no longer take up the glucose from the bloodstream. So you've eaten, glucose has gone up, insulin has been produced by the pancreas, but your cells are not receiving the signal to actually take up that glucose from the bloodstream. Insulin really is no longer able to communicate with the cells, you might say. Now, to compensate for that, for the decreased effectiveness of the insulin, the pancreas starts producing even more insulin. It notices that the glucose levels are still high because the cells are not absorbing the glucose. So it keeps pumping more and more insulin into your bloodstream to compensate, but your cells are not really responsive, right? So that doesn't work. And then over time, the pancreas, gets so exhausted that it just fails to keep up the good work. That's basically what happens when someone develops type 2 diabetes. It's just been too much for the pancreas. It doesn't know what to do anymore. Now, what happens to your hormones when you have this elevated insulin levels, when you have that insulin resistance going on, is that your ovaries start producing more male hormones. So that means that ovulation may be disrupted. It can contribute to conditions like PCOS. It's also associated with hormonal imbalances that can affect the quality of your egg cells, the receptivity of your uterus. It can hinder embryo implantation. It increases the risk of infertility and also pregnancy complications. And then in the long run, chronic insulin resistance is linked to obesity, to cardiovascular disease, and it further messes up your metabolism. You can see that, right? Because it's just out of whack. So that then creates a vicious cycle that further exacerbates your fertility issues. So you want to prevent insulin resistance, right? You want insulin to keep doing its job. Who's at risk? That might be important to know. Now, for some people, there may be a genetic component at work, right? But there's also a lot of lifestyle going on here. Obesity is an issue. A sedentary lifestyle, like a lack of physical activity, really reduces the body's ability to respond to insulin effectively. Go have a walk every day. Make sure that you keep your body moving, because that's how you make sure that you keep that communication between the insulin in your body and your cells going. Poor diets, so diets that are really high in refined carbohydrates and sugars and unhealthy fats, that can also exacerbate insulin resistance. And like I said, there may be some genetic predisposition as at work as well. So in a second, I'll touch on some practical tips, some things you might do to bring your body back to balance. But first, let's touch on inflammation as well. So we discussed that insulin resistance that happens when your cells stop communicating with insulin. Chronic inflammation basically means that you've got some sort of inflammatory reaction going on in your system for months or years. Like was my case, really, with all of those inflammatory processes going on at the same time. And normally, inflammation is really a healthy response to an injury or an infection. But when you have chronic inflammation, it means that your immune system is out of control. It keeps sending out signals to your body. It keeps sending out signals, even though there's nothing there to heal, really. There's different processes that can lead to chronic inflammation, but excess fat is one of them. So that's where we get back to your metabolism. And then I'm talking specifically about visceral fat, so the fat around your waist. What this fat does is that it secretes certain proteins called cytokines that promote inflammation. And now, to make matters worse, these cytokines can also alter your metabolism and promote insulin resistance. So these two processes, that chronic inflammation and insulin resistance, they can actually reinforce each other. And this is something that you see in women with PCOS who frequently exhibit this as low-grade inflammation. So that visceral fat, the fat around your waist, one of the ways in which that visceral fat appears is when you eat so many carbohydrates that you're producing so much glucose that it's much more than your cells actually need. That's why it's important that you have a healthy diet that doesn't include too many carbohydrates. These elevated levels of inflammation, they have similar effects like, insulin resistance. So they can negatively impact the quality of your egg cells, embryo development, endometrial receptivity. So that's how well your womb is able to implant that embryo. And that all makes conception much more difficult. Chronic inflammation, it also leads to an impaired sperm function and quality, impaired sperm quality in men. So that's why this episode is also really relevant for your partner. So what can you do? And the first question I always ask you is this information even relevant for you? Like, you might go to your healthcare practitioner, get your medical provider to run tests to see if there's chronic inflammation going on, insulin resistance. But you might also start by just feeling like, does this apply to me? One indicator is fatigue, especially feeling excessively tired or lethargic after meals. Do you have cravings for carbohydrates? That, increased cravings for sugar or refined carbohydrates, that can be a sign of insulin resistance. Difficulty losing weight, even though you're dieting, you're exercising. Increased hunger. Maybe you have dark patches of skin, especially in your neck, your armpits, your groin. High blood pressure, menstrual irregularities. These are all things that can point to insulin resistance. And then, with chronic inflammation, I guess that would be more obvious. Acne is one of them. All of those things that I had going on, like asthma, arthritis. I guess you would know. But again, this is something that you can check with your practitioner if you want to. So what can you do if you feel like you want to work with your metabolism? Nutrients are really important. I mentioned this already, right? Diets high in refined sugars can exacerbate insulin resistance. So balanced diets, which are rich in whole foods, they just support your metabolic health, your reproductive outcomes. I'm going to give you my top 3 tips that are really easy to integrate in your life. And even if you don't have anything going on, I think this is optimal hormonal support. Like changing your food consumption, adopting these tips, this will help you regardless whether you have anything going on or not. This is like long-term investment in your hormonal health. So the first tip, be mindful of the order in which you eat your food. You want to eat vegetables first, then your proteins and your fats, then your carbs, and then your sugars. There's some amazing accounts on Instagram. Glucose Goddess, I think I'll put her in the show notes, is one of them, who actually shows what happens to your blood sugar levels when you change the order of your food. So she will have like a meal that is not in this order and then compare it to a meal that is in this order. And you see straight away that her glucose levels remain much lower when she follows this order. It's a tip I also mentioned on the podcast on gut health, but just snacking on vegetables whenever you're in the kitchen or whenever you're cooking, that's already such a great way to change your food order. That's how you get your vegetables in. This can be a bit tricky at the start, especially when you eat a lot of casseroles or salads where you put all of the ingredients together. This requires a bit more work to separate them and eat your vegetables first, then the proteins, then the carbs, then the sugars. But it is so worth it. In my case, I had these really intense afternoon slumps. And ever since I started eating this way, that doesn't happen anymore. And it makes life just so much more enjoyable because I have energy again. Second tip is to always pair your sugars and your carbs with vegetables and protein. So it's okay to have a sweet treat, but do it after dinner because you've had your vegetables in, your protein, your fat in, so that will lower that glucose spike. If you have fruit, pair it with nuts. Like, don't just eat the fruit because again, that's sugar, that's a carb. Fruit is a carb. Pair it with nuts so you can dampen that glucose spike. I love my dark chocolate, but I make sure to always eat the type with hazelnuts because again, you have that pairing there that just lowers that glucose spike. The third tip, have breakfast. Have breakfast. Don't just have coffee. Don't have any sweet breakfast either. Have like a nice savory breakfast that includes vegetables and protein. So I just eat my vegetable leftovers from the day before. That's a really easy way to do that. Or I just snack on some carrots while I'm preparing my breakfast. But make sure you get that protein in at the start of your morning. Have a couple of eggs with Parmesan cheese, some Greek yogurt. That's how you set yourself up for success. That's how you start with regulated blood sugar throughout the day. It will actually lower your stress levels. That's not, I didn't really touch upon that in this episode, but not having breakfast, not feeling hungry in the morning, that's actually a sign that something is going on. So start having those breakfasts and see how that changes, how you feel throughout the day. And then over time, you'll probably notice that you'll get that appetite back in the morning. So those are 3 easy tips, I would say. Be mindful of your food order, always pair your sugar and carbs with vegetables and protein, and have a breakfast that includes vegetables and protein, and don't just have coffee in the morning, and don't have like croissants or waffles with sugar. Make sure you have something savory there. And then final thing is lifestyle and stress. I started this episode by telling you about all of the things I did to manage my stress levels and how that was such a crucial part of bringing down my chronic inflammation. This is what the research shows, is that stress also really affects your metabolic health and your fertility. You want to be aware of anything that's going on in your system. Stress, anxiety, depression, these are all things that can exacerbate your metabolic issues, that can impact your hormonal balance, that can further complicate your fertility. Now, it's a bit too much to go into detail here, but I just recorded an episode. It's episode 103 on the nervous system. It's about trauma, it's about the nervous system and the link to fertility. You can also download a free PDF with the main pointers at thatfertilefeeling.com/nervous-system. I'll put that in the show notes as well. Yeah, so to summarize, your digestion, the food you eat, the way your body is able to process that food, it's really crucial for your fertility. Every step of that digestive process, it involves complex hormonal and metabolic interactions that can really impact your reproductive health. And you want to maintain a healthy metabolic state for optimal fertility outcomes. So manage your insulin levels through a healthy diet and lifestyle. For women, it can improve their chances of fertility, but also for men. Track your chronic inflammation and see if there's any dietary changes that you can make. Uh, don't be overwhelmed. Just start by listening to your body. Start by really feeling into if this applies to you, if this applies to your partner. Listen to the episode again, listen to some of the other episodes, and see what are some of the next steps that you need to take on your fertility journey. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. I always love to hear from you. So if you want to send me a message, you can find me on Instagram at thatfertilefeeling or email me at francoise@thatfertilefeeling.com. I always love to hear from you and always get back to you and hope to see you back in 2 weeks. Bye bye.